Welcome to Interfaithing, a podcast for and about Jewish and Christian interfaith families,
where we explore the question, why families can embrace two faiths under one roof.
I'm Ari, the son of a rabbi,
with a degree from the Jewish Theological Seminary.
I'm Anna, the daughter of a minister with a degree from the Union Theological Seminary. We were co-teachers together at the Interfaith community in New York.
And 1 year of working together led to 15 years of friendship and collaboration.
To find us sitting here today, embarking on a new project.
Whether you are part of an interfaith family,
or you're exploring and interested in how different faiths interact with one another,
this is the space for you.
Subscribe to guarantee you never miss an episode.
And help us spread the Torah and gospel of interfaith wisdom far and wide.
And you'll also gain access to exclusive content like our holiday live stream events.
We hope you enjoy every episode.
Listen at your own pace.
Share with a friend.
And don't forget to subscribe. Without further ado,
welcome to our introductory episode, where Anna and I share our origin stories of why we are interested in interfaithing, embracing two faiths under one roof. Well, hello, Anna.
Hi, Ari.
How are you today?
I am very well. Lovely to be connected with you today. How are you?
I'm doing good. Very excited for us to begin our show. So, are you excited too?
Yes, I am so eager to get started.
For everyone who's listening, that
we started dreaming about this podcast about 8 months or so ago, and just amazed that we're here, getting this podcast off the ground.
So this first episode is our origin stories of why we are interested in interfaithing,
in embracing two faiths under one roof.
You know, it's interesting because Anna and I are not an interfaith couple, which I think people might find fascinating that we're interested in this.
But Anna and I were co-teachers at the Interfaith community of New York.
And these are kind of our stories of how, when we started with IFC, as it's known, that we got into this work and how we haven't really looked back and are very interested
in continuing to help Jewish and Christian interfaith families with this show.
And anything you want to add?
Yes, just again, for our listeners to understand a little bit or start to unpack some of the questions of why we are doing what we're doing. Or you already mentioned that you and I are not in a romantic relationship with one another. And beyond that, neither of our respective relationships are interfaith relationships either.
No.
And yet we have this incredible love and interest and care for interfaith families.
So a little more about us.
I'm a rabbi, conservative rabbi, graduated from the Jewish Theological Seminary with an MA in Jewish education and also a BA in Bible. Anna, how about you?
Yes, I am the daughter of a Methodist minister. And so with a Christian background that has been a part of my entire life story, that took me on to studying religion for a BA in undergraduate, and then carrying that on to a master's degree as well from the Union Theological Seminary in New York, where I completed a master's degree in systematic theology. And I don't think it was a coincidence that those two schools that we just named, JTS and UTS, are literally neighbors across
right
the street,
around the corner. Yep.
across the street from one another.
Right
so we
there.
were perhaps fated to become connected in some way.
So thank you to the original planners of JTS and UTS for putting us together, because all the way back
Seminary
there.
row, exactly. Yes. Yeah.
And as also I forgot to mention, in addition to being a rabbi, also the son of a rabbi. So we also have that preacher's kid kind of background here.
Yes.
In future episodes,
we're going to be bringing in stories from folks, especially folks who are in interfaith relationships or who have been involved in this work for a while. Clergy, couples, activists, advocates.
But for this episode, we're going to share our origin stories, how Anna and I got interested in interfaithing, in helping Jewish and Christian couples embrace two faiths under one roof. So Anna's story is going to go first, and then I'm going to kind of reflect on that story with some questions and thoughts, and then Anna's we're going to have a nice back and forth about that. And once that is done, then we're going to hear my origin story, and Anna's going to reflect on that, and we'll go from there. All right. Sounds good?
Sounds great.
All right. Let's get this going.
I had gotten connected with the IFC in 2008 through someone who was a student with me at grad school and also one of the teachers at that time. I had, like maybe a lot of people studying religion in the early 2000s, were very interested in interreligious dialogue. There's this whole other aspect of the interreligious dialogue world, which is interfaith families. Well, I will say today that what I remember being interested in was the fact that these families existed. And even if there were so many aspects of their faith traditions that were intimidating to them or unexplored, that they were living this reality, that there was this embodied component to their existence as interfaith families, where, quite frankly, a lot of the work of interreligious dialogue is very academic. It's getting people together in a room and having conversations around tolerance, understanding, and acceptance. And so, yes, relationship building, but a family unit is something very different. And so how are these traditions that are very different and have like clear dividing lines where a lot of people would assume they shouldn't coexist? Like, here they are under one roof. And you've got two people who decided to bring their lives together, and they also have children. And so seeing the embodiedness of interreligious dialogue and wanting to be a part of those journeys and let it open me up personally, spiritually, and intellectually to thinking about these conversations in a different way was just very exciting and attractive. I do have to say that it deepened my own spirituality because it made me have to think about things in a way that previously I might have taken for granted. And in order to make these things relevant and also meet these families where they were, I had to be able to talk about my own faith background and the theology and the beliefs and the history and everything else. It made me, in certain ways, like approach my own spirituality and faith upbringing with a completely different lens, and therefore like deepen it. I was really looking for examples of Christian spiritual life and Christian theology that were not rooted in conversion, because, I grew up in the South, eventually relocated to New York. And so the majority of the church communities, also a clergy kid, right? My dad was a minister, a preacher. And so the vast majority of those church communities that we were a part of were very evangelical in their approach to Christianity. Therefore, like conversion and bringing people to Jesus is a key component of their faith. And there were elements of that in my experiences in college and then continued through graduate school, I needed to distance myself from because it didn't feel right to me. I needed to put that aside and unpack it. And so then getting to discover not just interreligious dialogue, but also something like interfaith families, where exactly the whole point is that these two people have gotten together to share their traditions, and one is not trying to convert the other. One is not trying to prove that the other is better. So it isn't just tolerance for the sake of tolerance. It isn't just lip service about being respectful or being nice. The lived aspect of wanting to allow your partner and then your children, by extension, to have a faith identity that is different than your own. And yes, even in conversation with you and my other Jewish co-teacher colleagues throughout the years, like being challenged in various ways, sometimes like not knowing either where I had a blind spot or where there was something that I was just being assumptive about as like a shared understanding. like kind of the Christian privilege, if you will, because here we are in the United States and Christianity is so deeply embedded in the culture that if I made a reference to something, that my Jewish colleagues would automatically know what I was talking about, and then realizing like, well, no, that isn't true. And so having to work through those things and in a sense become even more articulate about my own faith journey and spirituality because of supporting these families in this way through the IFC.
So, Anna, I'll tell you one, we obviously had the conversation, but I found, especially in listening to it now, the two biggest themes for me were that it came out of that sense of interfaith dialogue, of wanting religions to be in concert and in relationship with one another. Mm-hmm. And that it really did a job for you of deepening your own faith and thinking about how, mentioning that we're not in an interfaith relationship, but that we are in an interfaith engagement together. And that's part of what is really at the core of this work, is that when you're working with families, that the people who are working with them, the clergy, the teachers, are really learning from one another and therefore deepening their faith. So I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that sense of doing it, of coming to this work from the perspective of interfaith dialogue, and two, what it really means to deepen your faith with it.
So coming from the perspective of kind of my focus at the time around interfaith dialogue, and I think why that continues to stand out to me as you and I are engaging in this conversation now, is that so many of those interreligious dialogue spaces still don't know to consider, or maybe don't know how to incorporate and consider interfaith families. Right.
Are you talking institutionally, or are you talking about families themselves?
More institutionally. Yeah, right. Institutionally, and or then, like other organizations like the Parliament of World Religions is just an example of a name of an organization where like the purpose is to bring religious leaders together and focus on peace and other things like that. And so, of course, interreligious dialogue is a component of how organizations like that operate. And again, it's not to say that they are ignoring interfaith families, but their purpose and why they exist is very specific. And so then you have the lived reality of interfaith families. And I think there was also at the time for myself, I don't want to say that I didn't have a spiritual home, but I was in a very particular place in my own faith journey where I was exploring and looking for kind of new and novel ways of expressing one's faith and one's spirituality.
Right. And the fact is, like, you're bringing up how you had wanted to move a little bit away from the kind of Christianity that focused on conversion.
Right.
And in this organization, the Interfaith Community of New York, along with many of the other organizations that we're going to be talking about here on this podcast, it sounds like, although you were not the one receiving the learning, that by virtue of the teaching in that context, you were receiving the education.
Yes. And certainly part of my approach is to always consider myself a lifelong learner, that even in the role of educator, that I want to discover things alongside my students. I want them to raise a question in the classroom that challenges me, and also then model for them like the process of exploration and discovery, and to not be afraid to say, this is something that I haven't experienced before, and I'm open, and therefore with my co-teacher, I want to learn from you, and then to the students, I want to learn with you.
So then along those lines, and the other thing we want to model here, the idea of curious questions that kind of go a little bit further, is, do you think that there is an element of Christianity, or at least the way you're brought up in Christianity, that makes interfaith dialogue or that kind of learning more difficult in the sense that it's not something that is normally done, and it is something that can actually run counter to faith. I'll give a little bit of my own understanding from the Jewish perspective that although there's a lot of interfaith dialogue that's used within the context of Jewish life, a lot of it has been around educating others about Judaism for the purpose of saving our own skin, you could say, meaning like against anti-Semitism, to say like we want to do better to make sure that Jews are saved. And so therefore we need to kind of be in dialogue. But it's not necessarily about taking in information from other faith traditions and how it impacts our own. And so I'm curious from your perspective.
Definitely in my experiences, in many churches, there is the position of the pastor, the minister, the priest, the leader, if you will, whose role oftentimes is perceived, at least, as they are someone who is imparting knowledge. And certainly there is a deep, deep tradition in a lot of Christian communities, Christian denominations of like Bible study and personal spiritual growth. And also there can be in a lot of those communities a little bit more of like a top-down approach that when the pastor says something, when they are speaking from the pulpit, that maybe there are certain things that you don't really get to question. And I do think
this is the way that it is.
Exactly. And I mean, you hear that, right? Like a lot of Christians, if they are perhaps kind of letting someone know, like part of spreading the gospel is like people are going to quote from scripture, Jesus saying, I am the way, the truth, and the life. Nobody comes to the Father except through me.
Right. And that means anyone who does not do that or does not accept that, or who argues against it or who has a different opinion, their view may not necessarily be as accepted within the community.
Right. That at some point, folks are welcome to come to church. But eventually, in a lot of church communities, they want you to join the church. They want you to be baptized. They want you to take another step and not, for some people, what might be considered like a passive approach to participating in church, in worship, in spiritual exploration. It's to say, okay, but make a decision, like commit, right?
Right.
And it's not to say that that is wrong to want to do that. But for me personally, at some point it starts to feel like, or I have felt like in certain communities, that learning stops. Like the answer for everything becomes X.
Right. No longer is it the question, is it the wondering more? It's now that I have an answer, that's the answer. And now my job is to spread it, to share it. Which that's kind of what I heard what you said about conversion and wanting to move away from that. Not about inherently wanting to expand the fold, which yes, obviously that's a part of it, but it's also that the notion of conversion as the centerpiece.
Yes.
That there is an answer and our job is to share it.
Right. And, don't get me wrong, having grown up in those traditions and understanding all these things, I'm not saying that Christians should never do that, and that it doesn't make sense for that to be a goal. I also have a lot of personal and then like theological beliefs around the work of the Spirit. Right. And so how much is it of human beings trying to be in control of a process that is ultimately, at least in my understanding via scripture, like the Spirit moves where the Spirit moves.
Right. We can't control that.
Exactly.
And this is a topic that we are going to get into later on, because one of the main things that we're going to be focusing on in our first season are the different myths related to being able to embrace two faiths under one roof. And one of those myths that we will absolutely be touching on, and it impacts both faith traditions, especially, is that they don't mix. They're too different.
Mm-hmm.
Right? You can't necessarily, they don't work together. You have an answer, right? You have answer this, answer that, right? Was
Yeah.
Jesus, is Jesus divine or was Jesus not divine?
Mm-hmm.
And based upon your answer to that question, doesn't that identify you? So
Mm-hmm.
that is definitely one of the major questions that we're going to be engaging in. Oh, that's going to be a lot of fun.
Oh, it is. It's going to be so juicy.
So juicy. All right. I'll do mine. Does that sound good?
Ready for it.
All right. My origin story plays into the story of why I'm a rabbi here in America. I, son of a rabbi, grew up going to Jewish day school, Jewish camp, Jewish youth group, Jewish college, Jewish programs around, in Israel. But at the core, I decided to become a rabbi because I felt called to it. Felt God was calling me to be a rabbi, and then trying to understand what that call was. I've had moments of clarity in different ways. And so one of those moments of clarity actually had to do, ironically, when I was in Israel. And I say ironically because I was contemplating moving to Israel, making Aliyah, before I decided to become a rabbi, because of what Martin Buber said, that Israel, the land of Israel, is the place where a Jew can be the best Jew that they can be. That living in the land, especially with how the Torah and the Jewish Bible kind of points to living in the land as essential to Jewish life and existence, and how there's always that hope to B'Shana Haba B'Yerushalayim, to come back to the land.
Yeah.
That it's at the core of our own existence. And so how could I not live in the land of Israel? But when I got this call to be a rabbi in America, it's like, okay, well, now what does that mean? And it so happened that when I was in Israel for my third year of rabbinical school, I had an experience where we were sitting in a yeshiva in Nachlaot, in this beautiful, amazing religious neighborhood in Jerusalem, and heard the pitter patter of rain. And our teacher stopped the class and said a bracha, said a blessing over the rain, because of how special it is to hear the rain fall in Israel. That rain falling in any other country, in any other place in the world, is not as special to the Jewish soul as it is when it rains in Israel. And I felt that. And I also felt, but then why am I not being called to be here? And that's when I realized for the first time that the specialness of living in Israel cannot be replicated outside of Israel. And therefore, the opportunity outside of the land of Israel is going to look different and feel different than what Israel can offer the Jew. And as I started to think about that, what I came to as kind of like this realization is that America is the place where the most number of people from the most number of diverse backgrounds, especially faith backgrounds, have been able to live in relative peace and harmony for the longest duration in human history. And that is an opportunity that you can't really get when you're in Israel, but you can get in America, which is far from Israel, and yet also has some of the same kind of feelings around this is a promised land. This is a land that we are, to come to make the world better. And is part of the ethos and of this country. And realized that I felt called to interfaith work. This statement, grounded in tradition that helped me, is a saying from the prophet Zechariah, Bayom hahu yeh Adonai echad u'shmo echad, that on that day, God will be one and God's name will be one. And so it is this notion of ultimate unity that can come together through recognizing that God's called by many different names, and that it's not to say there is only going to be one name for God, but that all of the names for God are really united as one. So that, I'd say, theological foundation for me, and experiential foundation for me, of understanding what is God's call for me, led me to focus on interfaith work. And then thinking, well, how does interfaith work actually work within the context of people's lives? Like, it always seemed to be the extra thing that if you have extra time to do, whether you're in the rabbinate or in academia or whatever it may be, it's, let's talk peace, tolerance around a table, but we're kind of coming from a different perspectives and presenting, but not really engaging deeply. And that's when I realized that, well, there's actually one group that they have to experience this firsthand in terms of understanding that there are different names for God and how can there be ultimate unity to allow us to be able to function together. And that is interfaith families. And that reality of American life, especially from a Jewish context, in which over 70% of the Jewish population, the non-Orthodox Jewish population in America, is intermarried. Okay. That here is the opportunity to be able to help families do that job, which requires an openness within the family of actually bringing those faith traditions together into relationship and into conversation. And so I wasn't interested in making interfaith families more Jewish. I was interested in helping interfaith families recognize and work on how their multiple faith traditions can help them grow and ultimately help American life grow. If you want to find a way to make it work, you have to figure out what is it that really connects you two together. And even though there may be issues around the term God, that there is something deeper, something spiritual, something that is greater than us, that unites us, and that we are able to express it in different ways. And in order for us to be able to make it work, we have to find how those differences actually unify us together. This is actually a model that we should really raise up and promote, because it is a supremely profound way of how religious life in America can thrive.
I know we've already touched on this, but I'm still nerding out for a moment, just in the fascination
that's gonna happen a lot.
So
I feel like during
often,
this podcast. Oh my God.
I'm gonna break the third wall, if you will, for a moment. Like, hey, listeners and friends, get ready, because we're going to be fascinated by so many things.
I know. In
this moment, I want to let you know what stood out to me, and then hear how you feel about it. Right. Sure. So the themes, plural, throughout your story, there is so much discernment, so much intentionality around your choices, right? Like professional, but then also like personal and spiritual, being embedded in that. And so you were interested in opportunities that were challenging, that were not the easy route. And if there was subconsciously or otherwise an element of you wanted to not do the obvious thing.
Yeah, it's funny you should say that, because I feel like that's, in a nutshell, one of the things that drives me with all this, is that not to make life easy. I mean, there are many different choices that I've made, especially when it comes to my own rabbinate. I was a full-time pulpit rabbi for 11 years and kind of walked away from that life when I could have continued, because I felt that I was being called to do something else. And with this podcast being the core of that else, and also to know that by virtue of this call being that which is else, that I don't know what my future holds for me within the context of my own denomination.
Right.
I am a conservative rabbi, grew up the son, nephew, and grandson of conservative rabbis, very steeped in that tradition, which is at its core is tradition and change. It's about a historical view of Judaism in the sense that that which came before, we are a part of now, and we are a link in that chain. So it's to conserve as much Judaism as possible for the maximum number of modern Jews. And in many ways, I believe in that model. And I would argue, and I am going to be making this argument in the right opportunities, that this kind of interfaith work is a part of what conservative Judaism has to offer. And I say that because I'm not coming at this from the perspective of I have family who are interfaith, right? Think about the number 70% of American Jews, non-Orthodox American Jews are intermarried. Right. So that seems to be the way in for many folks, because you meet someone, you fall in love, this has to be it. To come at it from a different perspective, it's like, well, you're making a choice. And so why would you make that choice? And I think it has to do with that sense of, you use the word like intention, of kavanah, right? Kavanah comes from the Hebrew word kivun, meaning a direction. And then we're supposed to have the kivun directed towards God. I became a rabbi because I love God. And I became a rabbi to love God because I love the way that Judaism approaches God. And that by virtue of that combination, this kind of call I find it to be really engaging, just learning so much more about it, to the point that you said you learned so much more about yourself, right? About your own faith journey. One of my favorite just little examples of this, to talk about nerding out for a moment, is that the very first line of Torah, of the Jewish Bible, we often translate as "in the beginning God created." Grammatically, that does not make any sense, which begs the question, so why does the Torah begin in a way that is not grammatically correct? One of my favorite midrashim, or Jewish or rabbinic legends, that actually breaks apart the word bereshit, which we often translate as "in the beginning" or "when God began," and says, well, it doesn't make sense grammatically, so it's got to be pointing to something else. And that thing that it points to is some verses in Proverbs chapter 8, where it speaks about how chokhmah, or wisdom, was with God at the beginning of creation. So that is understood by the rabbis to mean Torah, so that God created the world with Torah. And in reading a book by Bart Ehrman, who is a Christian scholar on when Jesus became God, he taught me in that book that Chokhmah in Proverbs 8 is often understood to be Jesus. And so if you take a look, actually, I remember going into an interfaith dialogue meeting and looking up at the ceiling and seeing a fresco of Jesus holding a book, because wisdom and Jesus kind of go hand in hand. Yes. And so it's almost as if this same verse has within it that God created the world with Torah and God created the world with Jesus. And there are many who are like, I don't know what to do about that. And I'm like, oh my God, that's so fascinating. Right? That's the thing. Like it calls out to me. So how's that for nerding out?
Oh, I'm so here for it. And yes. Okay. Well, without diving down the rabbit hole with you,
we could be diving down every rabbit hole that comes,
which we could, we got to save some for later.
Okay.
But coming back to your origin story, I also have a couple of other points. It stood out for me that throughout your story, a lot of the language that you used, at least as I was listening, touched on these very rich visuals and imagery that was evoked for me listening to you, even starting with the story of the rain, and imagining like the rain then soaking into the ground and at another point in your story talking about groundedness and your roots, and then, you know, carrying that through to the end of your story around growth. And so I had this image come to mind listening to you very distinctly of the tree of life, right? And just how trees in general and how nature imagery can oftentimes like be associated with these topics, thinking about, you know,
Right.
again, roots, and then like what grows from it and the fruits of the trees, et cetera, et cetera. So I just wanted to share that with you, that there was a lot of very rich imagery that was evoked that I just personally this time found very powerful.
Isn't that what also, like, all of our faith traditions and both the monotheistic faith traditions, the pagan faith traditions, have an element of nature embedded within it, because isn't that a place where God kind of creates? And so that language, I think, also really resonates for a lot of people, especially in today's cultural milieu, you know, with a lot of concern about our environment, but also with the sense that when we go out into nature, we feel a closeness to God by virtue of being humbled by the grandiosity of nature. So thank you for picking that up. And I didn't even catch necessarily all like those references. I appreciate your insight there.
I have one more. This one I am going to pose as a question, because I really want, I want to pose it as a question and see how it makes you feel and then how you respond. Do you agree that continuity, Jewish continuity, if you will, continuity will be achieved by way of progress via this work?
Wow. That's an interesting one. So I want to give a little bit of background to some of the organizations doing this kind of work in order to answer your question, because I think that my personal answer to that question may be a little bit different than others, but I want to raise what others sort of bring. So we have the Interfaith Community of New York, started by Sheila Gordon, Dr. Sheila Gordon, Zichronah Livracha, who we knew. She very much believed that this kind of conversation among families, and especially education around kids, was central to the idea of Jewish continuity, as opposed to kind of getting people to, you know, say you can only do the Jewish thing. That would push people away. So to kind of bring them into this context where they could get their Christian learning, they could get their Jewish learning, and then they also have a space to kind of help understand how they kind of don't integrate together. It allows for people to have a stronger Jewish connection. So I know that was something really, really important for her. The Interfaith Family Project in Washington, D.C., which has been around for years. And we're going to be hearing from the two clergy of the IFFP who are amazing, absolutely amazing. That organization has been around for a very long time. And in many ways, much of what they do, or I would say a lot of their foundational work, was to be a place for Jewish families to continue the work of building the next generation of Jews by way of having a place that works for their entire family, where everyone can be interconnected. And I want to hear more from them about you know, if they agree with that idea. And then you have the Chicago School in Chicago, Illinois, which has also been around. I think they just celebrated their 50th anniversary or so. Yeah, amazing. And in many ways, they, you know, that one I would say probably has the strongest Christian ritual context, because it's housed in a Catholic church, and they do a lot of rites within the church as well. And I would say that in talking to one of the rabbis who is involved with them, absolutely amazing and fascinating and terrific rabbi, you know, she was saying how when the families were coming back for a reunion for a part of the 50th anniversary, and she was looking at them, many of them she would describe as culturally Jewish in many ways. So that's all to say is that I think that from the perspective of organizations, and I would think that from the perspective of many interfaith families and Jewish grandparents of interfaith families, continuity is important. personally,
Mhm.
continuity is not the main thing that I am thinking of. And I think that the first point that you made about seemingly kind of going against others, that's a little bit
Yeah.
here too.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, I fully admit that. It's to the point where I was saying it's not for me about making more people Jewish. It's about connecting people to God.
Right. So perhaps it's helpful for me, for your sake, and thinking about this question. What is your working definition of Jewish continuity? And is there a willingness? And you don't have to completely answer this question now, because what you just described through the organizations, like, was, I think, what, for anyone who might already be familiar with the concept of Jewish continuity. And so is there a part of you that's like, if I use the term Jewish continuity, it means something different?
Right. So I would say that in a albeit different way, when you talked about not wanting conversion to be at the core of Christian identity, I don't want Jewish continuity to be at the core of Jewish identity. And I mean that in a very specific way.
Mhm.
When we talk about Jewish continuity, it is talked about in the sense of wanting to ensure that Jews continue to propagate Jews and continue to do Jewish things.
Mhm.
And by virtue of doing Jewish things, or I would say, in order to do Jewish things, we want to limit the way in which other, especially faith traditions, impact that. For instance, one of the biggest questions that has been asked for eternity is, can a Jewish family have a Christmas tree? Right? In an interfaith
Yes.
family context.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
one of the things that is going to be we're going to kind of talk about is two different topics. One is about the kids and about what their understanding is and how they understand these things to be and how they identify, which is a key component to it. And also about how others might view, what it means for you to put up a tree in your home. Like, it obviously means you don't care as much about Judaism because you're adding this piece in.
Right.
So just as with Christian conversion, it's, here is a goal that inherently means there is no existence of another path. It's, this is the answer. This is the way. When it comes to Jewish continuity, it's often viewed as, this is the way, and you should not introduce other foreign elements into it.
Yeah.
So that's kind of what I want to push against. Because I believe in Jewish continuity in many ways. And the fact is, like, don't think that this chain ends with my generation. I want my kids to, and like hearing them learn Hebrew and to be involved. Like, I love teaching, I love engaging with kids and all that. But it's not just about the fact of doing it just for Jewish sake. It's doing it because it really connects to that deeper sense of, I'm a part of something greater. And as you and I have talked about in many ways, that interfaith families, when we have those conversations together, and they have to kind of deal with sort of the confusion of, was Jesus on Mount Sinai, and did Moses give this Sermon in the Mount, right? Like, there are those kind of moments of confusion, but that there are also ways of opening up dialogue to be able to get deeper into what these stories have to offer, and that they share both of these stories.
Yeah.
For those families, this is an opportunity. And that's kind of, I think, what we're all about, is sharing how beautiful of an opportunity this is to take advantage of.
Amen. And
how's that?
Also, well, I was just gonna say thank you for letting me ask a hard question. I mean, we went for it.
We did go for it. Hopefully there'll be many more of those.
Exactly.
All right.
This is setting the stage.
This is setting the stage. Oh my God. So this has been our first recording. Anna, it is such a pleasure to get this really going with you. So we're leading into the rest of the season of Interfaithing. If interfaithing is a verb, of Jewish and Christian couples finding ways to embrace both of their faith traditions under one roof, that there are many folks, even interfaith couples themselves, who wonder if it's even possible.
So much of what you're going to hear are stories, people's personal experiences. And so we are hoping to hold space and be a container for allowing people to speak for themselves in that way.
We're going to be talking about myths, on the myths of why folks do not believe that interfaithing could work.
So some of those myths that we're going to be exploring and bringing into conversation are around things like the differences between the two traditions. Like, how is it really that two people and or a larger family unit can truly embrace two traditions within one household?
And when it comes to clergy as well, that there are many different ways in which you can help encourage interfaithing that is authentic to your own understanding of your faith tradition.
And then as far as helping people find one another and be in community, we also are hopeful that by hearing from some of the other organizations and individuals who have engaged in interfaith work, that if you, audience member, are out there thinking that you're alone or that you don't know where to start, that this can also be a resource to encourage you to search and find ways that you can connect with others that are asking the same questions as you are.
So until we meet again, take care,
Stay curious,
and
keep
keep
interfaithing.